Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're looking at some of the best reads of 2019. In this video, I'm not looking just at things that came out in 2019, but basically everything that I read this year, the best of that list. Before we get started, I'd just like to say, if you like this channel, I post new videos every Monday and Thursday, so please consider subscribing for more content. Okay, this is going to be quite a long list, so I'm going to try and power through these books as quickly as possible, especially because there are some that I'm going to be reviewing in the future, and some that I've already reviewed this year. Also, for those of you that are familiar to my channel, you'll know that I look at fantasy books, horror books, and also classics more generally, so expect a mix of all of these three on the list. So first on this list is the final book in the Wheel of Time series, A Memory of Light. I started reading the Wheel of Time when I was 14, and got to about book 5, stopped reading it for a few years, tried again, I think when I was an undergrad, gave up again, and then finally, this past year, I went through the whole series, finally read this book, and it was one of the most satisfying reading experiences I've ever had. Not only is this an excellently written book, but it's a really satisfying conclusion to a fantastic series. I read, I think, this book and the 3 preceding books all this year, and I'd put them all on this list to be honest, because they're all of a really good standard. But I thought I'd put this one specifically because it's the last one and it was quite an accomplishment. Probably the most satisfying reading moment of this year for me was finishing this series. Next on this list we have Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. This is one of the best classics that I've read, and even now probably is up there with, after reading everything that I read this year, it's still at the top of my list. Not only is Dostoevsky great at crafting realistic characters with very complex psychologies, the plot in this story is just great. It's a real page-turner at parts, especially in the opening scene when the crime occurs. If you want to read a classic that will actually turn the pages and not make you roll your eyes, especially if you struggle with older language, definitely give this one a try. It's just a fantastic piece of fiction. Next on the list we have a Gothic classic that is kind of the opposite of a page-turner, at least in some parts, but still worth reading, and that's Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. This is a very hard book, as I said in my review of it, but it's also a very rewarding book, and even though the last 100 pages or so, and a few bits here and there in the middle, are slow and dense, Anne Radcliffe is just a queen at writing descriptive, evocative prose. She also has some fantastic characters that you wouldn't expect in a classic Gothic novel. In particular, I'm thinking of the Gothic heroine, Emily, but also some of the side characters. Just really good, also really hard, but I really enjoyed it, and it was worth persevering with those slow bits. Next on the list is a book that I am listening to the audiobook of, so I don't actually have it here. I may have finished it by the time this video comes out. I'm predicting that I will because I'm almost at the end. But the book is The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is a great fantasy book, and one of the best modern fantasy books that I've come across. I often read older books, so it's rare that I read something a bit newer, but I really enjoyed this. I think the setup is great, I think that the prose is just engaging all the way through, and the characters are fun. There's a good amount of comedy and tragedy and action, and it's just a perfect fantasy novel, and something that's so fresh and new. I just thought it was great. Also the audiobook, the reading is also really good, so if you don't have the audiobook, I'd recommend that. Next up is something else that I only got the audiobook of, and that is The Shining by Stephen King. This is probably my favourite Stephen King novel that I've read so far. I think that not only is the setup of the novel in the kind of, modern reimagining of Castle Dracula in this huge hotel, I think that's great. Also the fact that the characters are just so detailed and nuanced and fleshed out, which is something that sometimes can be a bit of a struggle when it comes to genre fiction like horror. All of that stuff makes it a fantastic page-turner. It means that when the terrible things are happening, you really care about the characters rather than, just kind of hoping they'll be bumped off at some point. Yeah, so great book and one of Stephen King's best. Back to another classic. Next on this list is Morris by E.M. Forster. Morris is, I think, one of the first gay novels ever published where that's kind of the main theme of the novel. It's a fantastic book and definitely underrated in E.M. Forster's own canon. It's usually seen as one of his lesser works, probably because it wasn't published in his lifetime, because he didn't want it to be. But I think that's not justified. I think it's one of the novels where his passion really comes through in a way that in his other novels the kind of romance aspect can be incredibly stunted and stiff, which is something that I mentioned in my review of A Room with a View. I think in this book you can really feel and sense his passion, and I think if you're interested in LGBT fiction, this is something that you should read as like a founding text type thing. But also, even if you're not interested in that specific genre, this is just a great book that touches not just on gay love, but also on class issues, on social issues that I think are just as interesting to anyone of any stripe of life. Okay, I'm going to cheat with the next one and include two books by the same author. Both by Angela Carter. We have The Passion of New Eve and The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman. Both of these books are great pieces of dystopian fantasy, off-the-wall, crazy. With Desire Machines, it's almost very hard to even describe the plot because it's incredibly surreal and cerebral. The language is incredibly difficult and peculiar. It's probably one of the most original texts I've ever read in terms of prose. I also like Passion of New Eve. The central motif is a dystopian society where a man is taken by these kind of group of tribal women who then force him to have a sex change, and the rest of the novel is kind of dealing with the repercussions of that for him / her at this point. I think it's a fantastic novel. It's so underrated, and it just kind of, both of these really blew my mind when I read them. So I definitely recommend these if you're interested in kind of surreal fantasy dystopia novels. Next, we're turning back to classic Gothic texts, and something that I would also consider to be a very underrated philosophical text, and that is Justine by the Marquis de Sade. This is a very difficult book to read because of the content of the book. It's definitely immoral in the sense that terrible things happen, and it's no wonder that this is the kind of book that has been banned for a very, very long time. That being said, if you can get past the visual element of it and the disgusting things that are occurring, there's actually a lot of substance in this text. Sade is using the terrible things that happen to Justine to illustrate points about the nature of vice and virtue and society and classes and all of this stuff, and it's really rewarding and also in places surprisingly funny. The way that Sade writes this, it's definitely not meant to be something to be taken seriously, at least in terms of the more graphic, horrible aspects of the book. So yeah, difficult read, but very rewarding and very interesting. Now moving on to the next book on this list, which is The Queen of the Damned by Anne Rice. This is probably my favourite Anne Rice novel that I've read so far. It's probably tied pretty closely with The Vampire Lestat. I think these two are pretty much on par, but because I do prefer a tighter plot, this is the one for me, because The Vampire Lestat is much more character-based and meandering, whereas this one has character work that's still really great because it's Anne Rice, but has a much tighter plot. I also really like the way she builds the vampire mythology in this one, and we get more and more tying it to Egypt and the Egyptian mythology. I just think it's really great, really well plotted, and if you haven't read this or The Vampire Chronicles, you should definitely give it a try because they're great books. Okay, there are just two more books now to go. First, we have The Ten of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This is another one that I've already reviewed, so I won't say much, but in terms of the Brontes, Anne Bronte is probably my favourite at this point. I'm yet to read any Charlotte Bronte, so we'll see if she can be Anne's book, but I doubt it. I think that the way she writes is incredibly beautiful and poetic. I think her characters are very well fleshed out, nuanced, and the relationships between those characters are equally fascinating. I enjoyed reading this pretty much all the way through. There wasn't a moment where I was bored or uninterested in what was going on. So yeah, great book and probably my favourite classic of the year. The last book on this list is also one that I only have the audiobook of, but I wanted to mention because it's, again, a Gothic giant, and that is The Monk by Matthew Lewis. This one is just great in terms of its plot, and also amazing when you consider that Matthew Lewis was like 19 years old when he wrote this book. If you like those Gothic novels with, big brooding atmospheres and very theatrical language and very dramatic plots, then you'll love this one. I think between Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis, they're like the giants of Gothic fiction, and I don't know which one I prefer yet. We'll see what happens when I've read more of their work. If you were to read a Gothic classic and you're not familiar with the genre, I would actually recommend reading The Monk before reading Anne Radcliffe. Not because I think that Anne Radcliffe is worse than Matthew Lewis, I think they're pretty much on par, but just because The Monk is a little bit more engaging, a little bit tighter plotted, and probably more modern in the way that its horror works. And Radcliffe is much more veiled, mysterious horror, whereas The Monk is much more outright terror and gore, essentially. So, yeah, if you're interested in Gothic horror, give The Monk a try, and if you like it, then definitely give The Mysteries of Udolpho a try as well, because both are really great, and I think you'll enjoy them. Okay, that's it for this very long list. Let me know in the comments below what you think of any of these books, if you've read them, but also let me know what the best things that you read this year were. I'm starting to think about sorts of things I'm going to be reading in January, so it'd be great to get some recommendations from you guys, so let me know in the comments. Later in the week, there will be a video looking at some of the worst things that I read this year. It will be a much shorter list, because there wasn't that much that I didn't enjoy, but be on the lookout for that, and I'll see you all in the next video.